you hear me on this mic in the room? Okay. Maybe we can turn the room up a little bit. I don't know if everyone can hear in the back, though, it's fine. We'll just keep going. You go? Okay, never mind. All right. Well, welcome to our second lecture on biblical scholarship and literacy. I'm James Carroll. This is the adult RE offering on the Bible. Last time we covered several questions, cultural influence, etc., and we talked about the conflicting goals we have for this class of trying to make sure we all kind of know the biblical stories so that we can interact with our neighbor to learn a little bit about the scholarship involved in those stories that tell us where we think the stories came from and what they're. And those really do kind of conflict because when I do one, I kind of preclude the other, and so and it'd be difficult. But that's what we're going to try to do here. We talked about the composition and language of the Bible: Greek, Hebrew, Greek for the New Testament, Hebrew for the Old Testament. We went into the source manuscripts, including ancient translations like this, important, and we'll mention the Septuagint again today, and how it impacts how we interpret things. We gave some examples of some transmission errors that show that the Bible has got, difficulties in figuring out not what it means, but what the original text even was. So was the original text say this or that? We got these different witnesses, we call them, that each say something slightly different. And we talked about the Israelite core narrative, which is you began in Babylon, you were brought out by God to become a monotheistic people, you settled in the land of Canaan, you were slaves in Egypt, you came back to Canaan, there you established a united monarchy and then a divided monarchy, and then the nation of Israel was destroyed, and then the nation of Judah was destroyed, and you were taken captive back to Babylon. So you start in Babylon, you end in Babylon, and that's the core narrative. We have books about them going back from Babylon and rebuilding the temple, but there was a core narrative in the original composition before those attacks. Reading the Bible with different translations. So to review, about the KJV, new KJV. The KJV's difficulty is that it has Old English that is difficult to understand. It's trying to read Shakespeare. But it was also done before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of these other later things. And so as such, we know a lot more about what Hebrew means than we did when the King James was translated, although its language is really beautiful and it's hard to give it up. But it has difficulties if our goal is to understand. Whenever I didn't understand something in the King James, the thing I did is I turned to the NIV, and if I still didn't get it, I turned to the Hebrew, and that meant I was usually fairly desperate. But the NIV is what I went to as my go-to translation as a believer, and so I run here. Now, the difficulty with the NIV is the evangelical translation. It assumes perfection of the degree and its historicity, the degree that we probably wouldn't. And so it's got, I also recommended the NIV Study Bible, which is this one. This edition has all sorts of interesting and useful questions about authorship and culture and things like that are very useful, but it is from a belief and almost from a fundamentalist perspective. And I'd forgotten just how much it was from a fundamentalist perspective until I went back and tried to use it for this class. But there's this one. There's, of course, a Jewish translation, the Society or JPS, and there's a new JPS. There's also the revised version, so there's a standard version, a revised standard version. Now there's a new revised standard version, and one wonders what they're going to do next. The third redundant aftermath of the Revenge Again third time, which is the latest Jaws movie. But they keep tacking these letters onto the front as they revise them, and the RSV is the one usually used in college courses and academic courses, and it just so happens that our church has 4 of them. So I pulled them out, and they're up front here. If anyone actually wants to grab one and read along, you can do that. So I recommend the Revised Standard Version or the NIV. The NIV is really useful if you want to communicate with your evangelical neighbors to read it in something they're used to. We also have things like the New World Translation, which is the Jehovah's Witnesses. They did their own translation, which leads to some of their unique theology, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then we've got these vernacular translations like the Living Bible, which I don't recommend. To understand the literary merit of the text, you need something that translates the text and actually leaves the idioms as they were, so we can then talk about them and try to interpret them. The problem with that, of course, is those idioms don't always translate immediately to our vernacular. We misunderstand them. So we need something that leaves the idioms as they were so we can talk about them, but you need someone to talk about them, otherwise you're lost. The translations like the Living Bible skip that and just try to put them in terms you would understand without actually translating the text. They just describe in their version of what this means. So today, that was time. Talk about resources specifically for the book of Genesis and the creation account. Now, if we do and then we'll do 15 minutes or so on a topic of general interest. In this case, we'll talk about the Hebrew and Greek names for God. So at each class, we'll talk about something that is of general interest for understanding the Bible in general. And then we'll do a deep read in some text or other. Now, if we read everything at this rate, 1 to 2 chapters a class every month, we'll all be dead before we get done. I'm not going to do that, don't worry, but I think the first few stories, Genesis, the creation of the world, the fall of man, these things have so much implications for the theology of Jews and Christians that we need to do those in great detail, and then we'll start to go faster. But we're going to do 15 minutes on general interest and then a deep dive into one text, and we'll try to do that every week. So here's some resources that you can use for understanding, specifically in this case, the book of Genesis. The first one is an audio Great Courses lecture. So if you want to listen to something on the way back and forth from work, it's called The Book of Genesis, and it's by, let's see if I can read his name, Gary A. Rosenberg, I believe is what that small text says. To understand him, he's what I would call a maximalist. There's fundamentalists, maximalists, and minimalists is just some good language for understanding how different people interpret the text. Those terms never perfectly match anybody, but in this case, they give us terms that we can use to kind of describe what you're getting. He's a maximalist, meaning he's not a young earth creationist. That's a fundamentalist. He doesn't really believe that the flood covered the earth. He understands that those texts were borrowed from Mesopotamia and Egypt and things like that. But when we get to Abraham, Moses, he thinks those people probably really lived. He might discount the miracles in the Exodus story and the numbers of people, but he thinks there was probably something like an Exodus. He thinks that David probably really lived, Solomon really lived. He also discounts the hypothesis, which is, in short, the theory that the book of Genesis as we have it was created by 3 different sources, and then there's another source in later books called Deuteronomy source. So he's got J, P, E, and D, or the 4 sources that the documentary hypothesis claims contributed to the book, the first 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the law. He rejects the documentary hypothesis, not entirely, but for a lot of it. And he also dates a lot of the stories earlier than most scholars would. So that's his bias, but it's interesting because you get to see somebody with an alternate approach. I think that the stuff in that room is, we just need to turn their mic off. Thank you. So it's an alternate approach, and it gives you some idea of the uncertainty because it's not an approach that we can just look at and say this is impossible. At least I don't think. And so it gives an idea of an alternate approach. This text, which I have in a physical book here, is the Anchor Bible Commentary. This one is by a guy named E.A. Spicer, and he did his own translation and commentary on Genesis. He is a proponent of the classical documentary hypothesis, and he'll talk about the authorship, how we know it was written by different authors, and he'll divide up his translation based on with little letters telling you who wrote what part he thinks wrote what, the more classical scholarly approach to Genesis. And then we have this one, which is, of course, reads backwards because it's Jewish, and it's the Jewish Publication Society's commentary. They have one of these on a lot of the different books. This one up, it's fascinating. It's got the Hebrew, and it's got about, this much of the Hebrew, and then commentary. And so this one is really useful because these people are very, very good at the word plays. And he'll spend forever talking about the different word plays in the text, how this word sounds like this word, and that's an intentional reference to make you think about this in this way. And those things are very real, and the biblical author is very good at it, and they will bring those out. But again, from kind of a conservative Jewish perspective. Those are some commentaries directly on Genesis that I kind of recommend, some 3 different ones from different perspective: a Jewish perspective, a scholar's perspective, and then a maximalist perspective, a mainline scholar and a maximalist. Okay, let's talk about today's kind of introduction topic, and that's the name of God. Why do I care about the name of God? Well, when we read a translation, the Hebrew is hidden from you, and the Hebrew names of God are important for interpretation and dating and for authorship, as we'll see. And so what I want to do is help you know when you see an English word what the underlying Hebrew is. And most English translations, including the NRSV and the NIV and KJV, all follow this convention. And that is, when you cast the Hebrew word, they translate it God. Now, to understand what Elohim means, Eli was a known Canaanite deity. He was a father god with a long beard who dwelt in tents. Believe it or not, important. And Hebrew is cognate with Canaanite, so that means the languages are just dialects of the same language. And so El is just the generic term for God. And for some reason, the Hebrew version of it has the I am on the M is the equivalent of the English S. It's plural. So this is a word that in the Hebrew ends in S everywhere, but it has singular adjectives, verbs attached to it. So it's a singular word that looks like it should be plural, which is kind of bizarre. And this has been interpreted lots of ways. Of course, Christians like to point at it in that idea. A very common Jewish interpretation is to see it as the royal we. So if you know what the royal we is, in medieval times, kings would, when they referred to themselves and to their actions, they would say, "And we shall make a law too." And that would declare themselves as kind of the representation of the entire nation. They, the nation, would make this law. And it would also declare their sovereignty and majesty. And so there's this idea that the Jewish people are making their term plural to represent the sovereignty and majesty of God. The problem with that interpretation is that there is no example in the ancient Middle East of the royal we, not in Mesopotamia, not in Egypt, and not in Canaan. And so that interpretation appears anachronistic because it's a medieval sort of thing. Of course, that's an argument from silence, so we could unearth a tablet with the royal we in it tomorrow, and all of our views would change. We don't really know why they took the Canaanite El and turned it into Elohim. But the term in the Jewish use means God in general. There's a couple passages that almost look like they're still referring to an old Canaanite deity that kind of didn't get expunged from the later cleaning of the text. But for the most part, it just means God in general. It can also mean divine. It's a word actually sometimes used for the heavenly council, for the other heavenly beings like the Elohim, the angels. So the angels will be called the Ben Elohim, the sons of God, but also just the Elohim because they themselves are divine. And so Elohim is an interesting word. It can mean divine, it can mean God, it can actually mean a Canaanite deity. So for example, in Psalm 28, Yahweh is described as a storm god, which is not true of El, but it is true of El's sons in Canaanite mythology. So it's almost implying that Jehovah, which we'll talk about Yahweh in a minute, is the son of El, which implies an earlier mythology that was then expunged as they became more monotheistic. Also in Psalm 89:8, it says, "For those who in the skies compares who in the skies compares to Yahweh, who can be likened to Yahweh among the sons of El. In this case, it's Elohim, the sons of El. So it's almost implying that El is the Father God who has lots of children, and Jehovah is one among many of those children. Now, though that it would, if it's a preservation of this earlier concept, that would imply once upon a time the Jewish people were polytheists, and they slowly moved into monotheism. And at the time that El was God, the Canaanite father god El, and that he had children. This is the Canaanite mythology. In Canaanite mythology, the children are Baal, and there's another guy who I can't remember. And they're implying that no, Jehovah is El's son, who then becomes king of the world, but El is the father god. So there's possible hints of two different gods once upon a time that got merged, and maybe some hints of that made it through the text. The next one is Lord. This word just means master. So it can be applied to an earthly master or a heavenly master. So it's often applied to God the Father. And that is the Hebrew Adonai that just gets translated Lord, lowercase. Then we have this word, YHWH, which is Yahweh is the way most scholars will pronounce it. We actually don't know how it was pronounced. This is the name of God used in the Hebrew text. And it was considered so sacred that it was only pronounced once a year at the temple by the high priest during the priestly blessing. And so at some point when the temple was destroyed, people forgot how to pronounce it. And when the Jews would read the text, they would never try to pronounce the name. It was too sacred. And so when the Masoretes later went in and put little dots above the letters to tell you how to vocalize, they put the vowels for Adonai over Yahweh. So here's the consonants, YHWH. They put the vowels for Adonai there, A-O-A, and in English that becomes Jehovah, which is where we get Jehovah. So the English word Jehovah comes from the vowels for Adonai over the consonants for Yahweh. And the vowels for Adonai were put there by the Masoretes because they wanted to remind you, don't pronounce this word, pronounce Adonai. So as they read it, they would say Adonai every time they came to this word. Now that's also why the King James and these other translators chose to translate the name Lord, because the Jewish tradition is to say the Hebrew word for Lord whenever you come across this word because the word is too sacred. But they capitalized it to let you know that underneath here is the Hebrew word Jehovah. So let's move quickly to some examples. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. There you can immediately see what the Hebrew was. The Lord in all caps is Yahweh, and God is Elohim. Here's another example. Abraham planted a grove in Beersheba and called there upon the name of, all caps, Lord, Jehovah, the everlasting God, Elohim. And the term everlasting God is actually the names we have for the Canaanite god El. He's called the everlasting El. So they're even using some of these Canaanite terms for the deity. So Greek is very important, though, for later use. In old times, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. And I didn't put this in English characters because I assume many of you do math and you kind of know what these Greek characters sound like, but I'll pronounce them for you. God becomes Theos. That's where we get Dios in Latin, and it just means God. So, but then they do Kurios for both Adonai and for Yahweh. So Kurios is the Latin word, or the Greek word, for master. Now, this matters. And the reason it matters is because when we come to the New Testament, the New Testament had, as its Old Testament, the Greek translation, the Septuagint. And those, the New Testament authors were reading the Septuagint. We can tell that from how they quote the Old Testament. So they're writing in Greek, and they're quoting the Septuagint. And here's why that matters. They talk about God, Theos, and they talk about Lord, Kurios. And therefore, when they say things like Jesus is Lord, there is a connection there intended between Jesus and Jehovah in the Old Testament, which is coming through the Greek, because Jesus is Kurios, and Kurios is the Greek for Lord, used to translate the Septuagint, all these references to Jehovah. So Jesus is Jehovah when they say that. This is a Trinitarian concept, which I don't know how well that'll go over to a Unitarian Universalist congregation, but the text as we have it today in the Greek New Testament is explicitly Trinitarian. That doesn't mean it wasn't altered at some point, but this reference only makes sense when we understand how the Old Testament text that they were reading had been translated into Greek, and then we can understand their use of the term Greek to teach this idea that they believed that Jesus is the Jehovah of the Old Testament. Now, how you translate that in modern terms matters. So these words matter for history. They tell us something about the development of monotheism in Israel. They matter for authorship because, as we will see in a minute, different presumed authors of the Old Testament, different source material, that JDPE theory, will use different names for God. And we can kind of tell who wrote what by what name they use. And it also matters for theology, for understanding this concept of the Trinitarian use in the Old Testament. And let me give two modern examples of how this has been altered. The first is the Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe that the expunging of the name of God from the Old Testament by putting Lord everywhere instead of Jehovah is kind of a violation of God's name. You're taking God's name out of the text. That's why they're called Jehovah's Witnesses. So they went back to their Old Testament and translated everywhere that Yahweh shows up, they translated it Jehovah. That's their translation. Translation matters for theology because now we should not be surprised that they are Unitarians of a sort, because they've broken the link between Jesus and Jehovah. And so now, when it says Jesus is Lord, that has nothing to do with Jehovah of the Old Testament because we've translated Jehovah as Jehovah everywhere, and we've taken out all these lords. And so it impacts their theology. Translation impacts theology. In this case, I believe inappropriately so, because again, the New Testament of these people was the Septuagint. The Old Testament, of the New Testament authors was the Septuagint. Let me just show you also how the Mormons do this, which is also relevant. Mormons actually don't believe in the Trinity, but they're not really Unitarians. They believe in two divine beings, Elohim and Jehovah, and they consider them separate beings. But they also believe that Jesus is Jehovah. So Jesus is Jehovah, but Jehovah had a father named Elohim. Now, that is bizarrely similar to the Canaanite origins of this stuff. But it is also, it does extreme violence to the text because most of the Old Testament authors lived in a time when the two had been conflated, and will say things like Yahweh Elohim as a single divine name. We'll see that in a minute. They also will do things like talk about how there is no God but Jehovah. There is no Elohim but Jehovah. So again, that is a later thing, but it is, when you put these names back, and what the Mormons are doing makes sense in English. It doesn't make as much sense in Hebrew. That's kind of the point. And yet it still has this weird match to what we think was the earliest theology. Okay. Now we're going to move into creation. We're going to do so now we've done something kind of general interest. We'll do a deep dive into a specific text, and hopefully we'll show how that general thing we did relates to our deep dive into this text. It may surprise some of you, but there are two accounts of the creation in the book of Genesis, not one. And that shouldn't surprise us, though. Most ancient Near Eastern religions and cultures had multiple accounts of creation. They had, the Babylonians had 4 or 5, and so did the Egyptians. And in this case, there are two that perpetuated in Hebrew traditions that got just stuck in the book of Genesis, one after the other. And so the first one starts in Genesis 1 and goes to Genesis chapter 2 and the middle of verse 4. So right in the middle of a verse, we have the break between the two stories. That's because the verse, chapter, and verse numbers were created much later, and whoever did them didn't realize where the division should have lain. And then in the beginning, second half of verse 4 to verse 24, we have the second creation story. So the first one starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it goes clear to the text that says, this is the account, in this case, generations, of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So the creation of the heaven and earth to when the heaven and earth was created. That's one story. And then the other one says, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and goes clear to, and they, the man and the wife, shall be one flesh. That's the second creation story. You'll notice two things here. The first one uses Elohim. The second one uses Yahweh Elohim as their names of God. And the second one is referencing the man and the woman, and it has a lot more to do with Adam and Eve. And it leads right into the fall story. This fall story is part of the second, just as part of the story from creation. So the second creation story leads right into the fall from the same source and author. So these are created by two different sources. Now, I'm not going to do the documentary hypothesis in detail. That will be the subject of a later one of our 15-minute introductions. But I am going to introduce you to at least one of the sources, in this case, P. P is the author of our first account, and I'm going to introduce you to P and what he's like and how he writes in this first one. And then we'll have a kind of a discussion of the documentary hypothesis in detail later. So let's talk about and read P's account of creation. So the first question is, what was there before the creation happened? So again, I'm going to read in the NIV. There's RSVs up here if anyone wants them, and you can read along, or you can just listen or whatever you'd like to do. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving, hovering in this case, over the waters. It really means moving, sweeping across. The word has a connotation of movement. Okay, so what was happening before the creation, and is there something before the creation? Now, I want you to notice the choice of translations makes a difference in how you interpret this text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that implies that God started out from the very beginning and created the heavens and the earth. So what was there before God created? Nothing, because he created the heavens and the earth. And then it tells you that his initial creation was formless and void and darkness, etc. The problem with that is that it implies a bad performance on God's part in his initial creative effort. And then we enter day one when God creates light. And the problem is that initial creation outside of the days. And so another way to interpret that is the first part has to do with what was there before God creates, and then God begins his creation with the first day. And what came before was what was before. But that depends on how you translate it. Now, the NIV translates it, in the beginning, God created. And the reason it does that is they're evangelicals, and they believe to maintain God's sovereignty, they have to make God the creator of anything, everything. To admit pre-existent matter before God's creation is to violate God's sovereignty, because he didn't create everything. This is the idea of creation ex nihilo. But this is the list of things that are there: formlessness, emptiness, darkness, and the deep, or the abyss. Those things are generally associated in the ancient Near East with evil, with badness, with non-goodness. And so it's almost like the first thing God creates is evil, and then he creates good stuff, which again is problematic. This is Spicer's translation, and you ought to compare it with the Jewish Publication Societies because it's very similar. It makes the first bit a dependent clause. When God set about to create the heavens and the earth, the world being then a formless waste with darkness over the water, over the deep, God said, and then a spirit wind from God blows across the water, and then God says, let there be light. I actually messed that up. This should be, anyway, the spirit moving. If you want to compare this to the ancient Near East, in Egypt, there are 8 deities called the Ogdoad. These are the pre-existent beings. They're usually drawn in water, blue. That's the blue picture here, with faces for serpents and frogs. They're the serpents and frogs that live in the water. And they have names that mean something like formlessness, hiddenness, invisibility, darkness, water, chaos. This is the names of the Ogdoad. The pre-existent stuff in Egyptian theology then is the same as the pre-existent stuff we get in Genesis. Enuma Elish is also relevant. The Enuma Elish means in the day when on high God created, etc. The Enuma Elish. And in the Enuma Elish, a god named Marduk slays a pre-existent being called Tiamat and creates the world out of Tiamat's body. Tiamat is the goddess of salt water, chaos, and the deep. She is the abyss mentioned in the Hebrew text is equivalent to Tiamat, that is slain by Marduk, who Marduk creates order out of Tiamat's chaos. You see, this is a cosmic battle between the different gods of order and chaos. And in the Enuma Elish, we have, before the creation, a divine spirit and cosmic matter, darkness, and the Absu, Tiamat, fresh water and salt water. Again, the pre-existent elements of the Enuma Elish look a lot like the pre-existent elements of Genesis. So how you translate the first verse has theological implications for questions like creation ex nihilo. And again, both Spicer and the JPS make arguments from the Hebrew grammar that it should be translated the way they do. And I believe those arguments are fairly convincing that it's a translational issue, but once you fix the translation, you see an existence of pre-existing stuff, and then that pre-existent stuff then corresponds to what we have in the Enuma Elish and the Egyptian versions. Now, what does that mean? If we go back and reread it and kind of interpret it this way, in the time when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless, empty, darkness was over the surface of a deep abyss of chaos, and darkness, chaos. Now, theologically, what this means is, and I believe this author, some commentators have said, maybe without even understanding the theological implications of this, they talk about pre-existent matter because that was kind of the culture. Because these are written by people who like the idea of creation ex nihilo. If you take this theology seriously and assume it was intentional by the author, what they're saying is evil has always existed. Chaos has always existed. God, this is the problem of creating an all-good God. How do you account for evil and chaos? And the answer is chaos and evil have always been around. God's actions are to bring order to chaos. And he's in the midst of creating order from chaos. He just hasn't finished yet, and that's why there's still chaos around, right? So that's a very profound, I think, theological implication buried in the text that I actually think was intended. I don't think this is an accident. I think the author knows exactly what he's doing and is answering a theological implication. Now, part of the issue is that there are other verses in the Bible that answer that question differently. And there are other verses in the Bible that specifically point to things like creation ex nihilo and claim that God created darkness by creating light. And by creating light, he also created darkness and is responsible for both light and darkness, etc. Second Isaiah, for example, makes that argument. So if you try to read the whole Bible as having one theology, you end up with contradictions. If you just let this author have a different opinion than the other authors, I think it makes a lot more sense. In any event, so this author's opinion is that evil is a pre-existent thing, I believe. So now we get the Spirit of God sweeping across the waters. That statement precedes the days. And I believe what we have there is the introduction of God. In other words, you begin out before God created, everything was chaotic and dark, and then the wind arrives. This is a wind from God, and in Hebrew, the word for wind and spirit is the same. Christians like to call it the Spirit of God. Jewish Publication Society prefers things like a wind from God. In context, what we have theologically is a wind blowing over the pre-existent cosmic waters. And this is the annunciation that God has arrived and things are about to change. Hasn't begun the creation. It's the only pre-existent thing, before the days of creation that is not associated with evil. And it's this wind. And the reason it's there is because it's the annunciation that the evil is about to be challenged by God's arrival on the scene. And then we start getting the days. So God begins to create with the following methods. These are the way the text describes the creation. God created, God said, and it was so. You notice he creates without description of how. When it describes how, he says something and it happens. So this is creation by fiat, by decree. God speaks and it happens. This is a very, the sense here is of the omnipotence of God, in contrast to Marduk and Tiamat, where creation happens by combat between the chaos and the order. In this case, it happens because the God of order shows up, sees the chaos, and says something, and it happens. So there are similarities to the old Babylonian myths and differences, and both matter, because the differences tell you how the author, who is clearly familiar with the Enuma Elish, is critiquing that earlier view of how the world works. For them, God is all-powerful. He's not in a combat. He would have won the combat if there was any combat. There's no issue there. God just shows up, sees the chaos, and speaks, and it obeys. And then what does he do when he speaks? Well, he separates, divides, he names, he gathers. The seeds all produce after their kind. God blesses things, and he sets certain things up to rule over others. And then he sanctifies and makes holy. That's how God creates. Those are the things he does in this account. Now, welcome to the world of P. P is known as the priestly source. That's why we call him P. The priests in Israel were interested in genealogies. That's why this is called the genealogy of heaven and earth when it's created. They're interested in earthly genealogy because priesthood in Israel is hereditary. So you got to trace your genealogy to prove that you're a priest. So they're interested in genealogies. They're interested in systemization, order, dividing the clean from the unclean. Now, P is the author of Leviticus, where you're all about dividing the clean animals, about not mixing different forms of thread in your clothes, but keeping the threads separate and ordered and divided. So you notice God is creating order, and then the laws they say about things like what you can wear, what you can eat, all are attempts to establish that same sort of order in the world that God used to create the world, to further God's creative acts of ordering things. You create by ordering chaos. You take chaos and you order it. You take this bungled mess and you drop it into separate piles, and now you've ordered it. You divide it, you separate it, you order it. The seed produces after its own kind, creating an ordered universe again, and God blesses. Now, one of the jobs of the priest is to offer the blessing. So here God is blessing the things he creates, specifically the animals, man, and the Sabbath. And so the priest's job is to offer the blessings to the people of Israel. And as such, they are continuing the creative works of God, or they saw themselves as continuing the creative works of God. They also have a hierarchy in their priestly structure. Thus, they're interested in hierarchies. So when he sets man to rule over the animals, etc., this is let him rule. They're interested in those sorts of hierarchies. And they are interested in holiness. Sanctified means to make holy. Those words are, one is a verb, one is an adjective. And they are interested above all else in holiness. And that's why the book of Leviticus is called the holiness code. It's the code of how to be holy. We should be holy, they say, because God is holy. And so to be holy is to imitate God in his creative acts and in his earthly, in his creative acts, but also in his nature, his being. And so that's why they live after holiness, separating unclean and clean, dividing what you can eat, what you can touch, etc. So welcome to the world of P. And the way they describe the creation is very indicative of P's worldview. So then the entire text is about God bringing order. The text is very carefully ordered and structured itself. It's a beautiful, beautiful, very succinct way of expressing very profound ideas in very few words, has refrains to divide it up into sections. So other creation accounts have orders in which things happen. They describe this happening and this happening. But this account actually numbers them in days. And it's the only one that does that. And it does it because it's part of the order of the systematic worldview that they're creating. We actually believe this text was used liturgically, meaning it was read at certain festivals, read at certain times, and part of their temple worship. So the refrains make sense in that sense. And these are the refrains that divide up the days. God said, let ... and it was so. God saw that it was good or very good, depending on the day you're reading. And there was evening and there was morning, the nth day. And those terms are used to divide up the text into various sections, giving us these sections: light and dark, water and sky, earth and vegetation, sun and moon, birds and fish, animals and mankind, followed by the Sabbath or rest. So if we read one just to give us an idea. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. Let me go back one. I'm reading day one. You know that. So let's look at these kind of refrains. Let's look for the refrains. God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. So notice we had pre-existing stuff that was chaotic and evil. God comes on the scene and makes the first good thing. The Spirit the wind announces his presence, and then he starts creating good stuff. So he saw the light that was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. You notice the emphasis on separation and division and ordering. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Notice the emphasis on naming. Now, in the Enuma Elish, it actually says, when on high and the world was without name and nothing. I'm slaughtering that because I'm doing it from memory, but the very first passage is about how nothing had been named yet. And so God shows up and starts naming stuff. There's power in naming things in this worldview. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. Day 2, God said, let there be an expanse in the waters. Expanse has the connotation of hammered out and stretched out pieces of metal that have been kind of pounded into a solid thing. What we're creating here is a division between the waters above and the waters below, something to hold up the waters above so they don't crash down on us. Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate the water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the waters under the expanse from the waters over it, and it was so. And God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. You notice he doesn't call the waters under the sea, which is what they are. Some very interesting things are happening here. First is that reference to very good was left out, and to good was left out. This is the only time that refrain is left out in all of the days. And he only talks about calling the sky. He never calls the sea. This is because, again, the sea is that symbol of chaos. He's separating the light from the darkness. Now he's separating the chaos. It's also very true that when he does use the word sea, and he has to, he always makes it plural. Yamim, the seas, instead of the sea. What's happening here is Yam is the Canaanite word for a god. And this will happen throughout the text. The author of this text will avoid any Canaanite words that are also names of deities. For example, the sun and the moon. When we get to the sun and moon, he calls it the lesser light and the greater light, which is an awkward way of saying the sun and the moon. He does that so he can avoid the Canaanite use of the term sun and moon, which are Canaanite deities, just as he avoids the Canaanite use of the term sea. But the god of the sea is this Tiamat character that is being slain. And so he leaves out intentionally the refrain. For the only time he leaves it out, it has to be intentional, is when it has to do with the seas. He doesn't say it's good. Everything else is good, but the seas he leaves alone. So you can see how this, and I'm not going to read them all, we don't have time, but you can see how these refrains chop things up into days for us. Now, again, this author is probably a tradition of things that are very old and that are carried on for a long period of time. And they have refined and refined and re-refined this story until it's in its current form. And the entire thing is a really large and complicated poem. And it's a poem that rhymes in thought instead of rhyming in sound. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Day 1, God creates the light and the dark. It's kind of bizarre that he creates the sun and the moon on day 4 when the light and the dark were created on day 1. And if anyone's ever wondered why that is, the reason is because it fulfills this poetic form, not because this is actually the order God. I don't even think the author intended to tell us the order things were made in. He's trying to divide the creation into pieces, just like we divide the light from the darkness. He's dividing the creative acts into chunks that he then forms into a parallel structure. So in day 1, we create the environment, the light and the dark. In day 4, we create the things that move, act, and control that environment, the sun and the moon, the light that control the light and the dark. Day 2, we create the environment, the water and the sky. So in day 5, we create the things that move and act within that environment, the fish and the birds. In day 3, we create the earth and the vegetation. And actually in the refrain structure, that's the only one that's kind of divided into 2. There's 2 different God said and it happened, God said and it happened. So there's 2 things, the earth and the vegetation in day 3. So on day 6, we have 2 different God said and it happened, God said and it happened. In that case, we have the animals and mankind. Why did that happen? Well, it's because I think the author didn't want to just lump mankind in with the animals. For this author, mankind is a special class of animals, so it had to be created, even though it happened on the same day, with a new and God said refrain. So there's 2 refrains. God said and it happened, the animals. God said and it happened, man. And to make the poetic structure work, he then had to go into day 3 and create the earth with one, he said and it happened structure, and then create vegetation with he said and it happened. So the refrains have a poem. 1, 2, 3 has 2, then 4, 5, and then 6 has 2, and they each line up with what happens and moves within the other. The other thing that happens is on day 6, the animals and mankind are told to eat the vegetation. They're commanded to be vegetarian. Again, P is interested in what you can and can't eat. Later, P will talk about when God allows us to eat meat, but the initial creation is vegetarian, and he's very explicit about that. That is, again, a hallmark of P. He cares about what you can and can't eat, and he mentions this original creation was without killing. That's important to him. The original world had no death, no killing, and there was no animals eating animals. And then we finish with the creation of sacred time, rest. God rests and creates the Sabbath. Now again, the Sabbath is not mentioned, just like the word for sun, moon, and stars, sun, moon, and the seas are not mentioned, because it is also the term for a Canaanite deity that is equivalent to Saturn. We still call Saturday, Sabbath, Saturday, even today. And so he leaves that term off and he just calls it the seventh day. It just so happens that the Hebrew word for seven sounds an awful lot like the Hebrew word for Sabbath as well. So there's a fun wordplay that he creates there. The root, though, for Sabbath is probably to rest, and for seven is seven different roots, but they sound alike, and so there's a fun wordplay that he creates. So this author, P, his words are carefully chosen. They have meaning. He's intentional about his word usage, and they each have theological import to the author that match with his worldview. The fish and the birds, the animals and mankind are all blessed, and then God blesses the Sabbath day and makes it holy, sanctifies it. Again, the temple was a manifestation of sacred space that the priests were in charge of. And so making things holy was their work. And here we're talking about holy time instead of holy space. We can ask the question, why didn't they say the seventh day God created the temple? And maybe it's because this was written during the exile when the temple would be destroyed, and they're trying to find out how we approach holiness without our temple. Well, we do it in this holy time, the Sabbath. That's a theory, but we don't know for sure. But clearly, the connection between the Sabbath and the temple is intended. So, again, the order of events is the same as the Enuma Elish. We talked about the Enuma Elish having the same pre-existent matter, but it also has the same order of creating things like heaven and earth, sun, moon, stars, man, and then they conclude with the creation of the temple and sacred space. The Israelite version has the same basic order, but it concludes with the creation of the Sabbath. So the connection between the Sabbath and the temple is intended, both by the author. Okay, so it's interesting to point out that the Zoroastrians, if you're interested, I did a class on Zoroastrianism last week, last Friday, and then the month before we had 2 classes on Zoroastrianism. It's interesting that their tradition has the same order of days. We had a whole discussion on that similarity and how it probably arose, and had all sorts of interesting theories. But you notice their last day is the creation of fire, their sacred element. So for the Enuma Elish, it's the sacred space. For the Hebrews, it's the sacred time. And for the Zoroastrians, it's the sacred element. Fire was created on the 7th day. So let's talk about the cosmology we have here. I talked a little bit about the firmament. Well, what is the firmament? Well, it's this dome that supports the sky. It separates the sky. So what we have here is not a scientific worldview of the world. Once you know the Babylonian and Egyptian cosmology for how they viewed the world, it's impossible to read this story and not see it in the story. So attempts to match this with science, the young earth creationists, for example, fall flat on their head for not just scientific reasons, but for textual reasons. They're quoting the Babylonian cosmology, and there's no reason to assume the Babylonian cosmology is right. What they're doing is making theological points within the existing scientific worldview of the time, which is that the sky is blue because it's made out of water. There are windows in the firmament that separates the waters above from the waters beneath, and when the windows are opened, it rains. And the earth is a place of dry land floating in the midst of the chaotic sea that surrounds it. This is Yam and Tiamat. With water in the underworld and fountains that create springs and wells. That's why you can dig a well and get water, or springs bubble up from the ground. This is another picture of the same sort of idea. This one I like because it helps us see what I see in this, which is a placenta with the watery womb. The world isn't created, it is born. And this is just as we are created with the placenta in the womb, the world is born in the same way. So they're making an analogy between birth and creation. This is the Egyptian view of the same thing, the firmament. Above we have Nut, the sky god. On the bottom we have Geb, the earth god. Notice they invert who's the feminine and the masculine. Usually the earth is feminine, the sky is masculine. They invert it. And between them we have Shu, the god of the air, that holds them apart and creates space for the sky, the environment, the wind, the atmosphere, to exist between the heavens above and the earth beneath. And so this is the firmament holding up the sky and separating the sky to make room for us to exist. That's what we have in day 2 in Genesis, is this worldview of separating the waters above from the waters beneath and making an atmosphere in the midst where we can dwell between the two. This is again related to the placenta and to birth and to these concepts of birth. So welcome to the world of P. This is one author. We're going to talk about the other authors later, and we'll talk about the documentary hypothesis as a whole later. But we gotta, at least at this point, talk about the worldview of the author of this text before we delve into the whole thing. So again, birth. When we get to the flood, this is a rebirth. We put the waters back, and then the dry land reappears. It even has a bird taking, the olive branch back to the ark. This is related to the Egyptian version, where when the dry land appears, the Horus hawk takes a stick and plants it in the ground and creates a flag, and the whole bird even is there in these other creation accounts. But the flood becomes a recreation or rebirth for the earth. And the Exodus then is the birth of the children of Israel as they pass through. And you notice how it begins in both the flood story and the Exodus. There's a wind that blows over the waters. That wind over the waters is a reference, direct reference to Genesis chapter 1, where God's presence and the beginning of creation is announced by the wind that blows over the waters. That's how it starts. And so in both the flood, there's references to wind over the waters, and it happens again in Exodus. In fact, it's the wind that parts the waters to let the children of Israel pass through, and that is the birth of the children of Israel. So the biblical authors are very interested. It's a national text with political implications, and they're trying to convey the birth of their nation, and they tie it all the way back to their view of the birth of the world. And it connects then to this idea of water and wind, which connects to physical birth. When a child is born, the water breaks, the child comes out and takes its first breath. As I told you earlier, the word for wind and spirit is the same in Hebrew, and they believed that as long as we lived, a wind lived inside us. You can feel it when you put your hand in front of your mouth. And as long as that wind is there, we are alive. That wind references our spirit. It's the spirit, the wind living inside of us. And so this idea of wind becomes connected to this idea of spirit. Next, we have the temple. For P, the temple is tied to the creation in so many ways, which when we talk about the temple, I'll go through. If I do them all now, we'll run out of time, which we already have. But understand that for P is the priest who takes care of the temple. They're writing a creation account that is used as a liturgy at the temple. And for them, they divide up the pitching of when you take the tent and you pitch it and you carry it off, there's 7 divisions and 7 parts. And when you create the temple, it's done in stages of 7. This is all connected to the creation account. So they take their 7 days of creation. Remember, they're the ones that divided creation into 7 days. And then they very carefully weave those 7 days into the different parts of their service at the temple. So this is very ritualistically laden and theologically laden as well. So how do the New Testament authors see this? In the beginning, en archon in Greek is exactly the Greek translation of Genesis chapter 1. So this is John 1, and he begins his gospel with the same words we have from the Septuagint translation of Genesis 1, the Greek translation. In the beginning was what? The Word. Now remember, in Genesis 1, God creates by speech, fiat. He's connecting here the Platonic idea of the logos, the word, which has a whole Greek philosophy connotation, with the way God creates through speech and turning it all into references to Christ. In the beginning was the Word. Through him were all things made. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness was not able to understand it. He's the true light, which gives light to every man, and he's coming into the world. This is the introduction to John. Again, you can see references to this creation account in Genesis 1, tied back to this new Christian theology. We also have Christ walking upon a stormy sea. The wind is blowing over the sea, and Christ comes walking across the sea on the waters. There is no way that an ancient reader would read that text and not see the connection to the wind blowing over the waters in Genesis chapter 1. The implication is intentional, and it's that Jesus is the creator of the world. And now we have the creator of the world, the master of the seas, walking upon the water as the wind and storm blows across the water. And then he speaks, and the waters are calmed. You remember those stories? They're found in Mark, Matthew, and John. And they all have references, again, to Genesis chapter 1. So Genesis chapter 1 has implications that will reverberate throughout the rest of the biblical text. It even has to do with Christian baptism. When Christ was baptized, he went down into the water. He came up out of the water. That's the dry land appearing out of the water. And then a dove descends from heaven, and the dove is supposed to be the Spirit. That's our breath over the water. And it's the Christian baptism ritual, which is symbolic of the rebirth of our souls. So, of course, it harkens back to Genesis chapter 1, birth and rebirth. Now, we're out of time. I'm not going to read the second account, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the fall, which is part of the second account. And so we'll just kind of overview very quickly before we quit. We will overview the second account, which has a different author, and then we'll do some of the details that matter as part of our discussion of the fall next month. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, halfway through, is the beginning of the second account. And you'll notice that he creates with different words. So I'll remove my picture here so you can see this. God made, the Lord God formed the man from the dust like a potter. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. He planted a garden like a gardener would plant. He took the man and put him in Eden. You can also see him picking him up and sitting him there. He formed from the ground all the beasts, again, like a potter. He brought them to the man to see what Adam would name them. Fascinating. Adam is naming stuff, not God. In Genesis 1, God is naming stuff. In Genesis 2, Adam is naming stuff. That's huge. It's very different. He caused the man to sleep and took out of his ribs and closed the flesh in the place thereof, and he made from his rib a woman, again, like a potter. The God here is anthropomorphic. He does things in the God of Genesis 1 is cosmic. He's about creating the heavens and building the sky. The God we're seeing here is human in his actions. He cares about Adam. Adam actually gets to say stuff. Instead of just being one among many things created, Adam speaks, Adam acts, and the God is far more anthropomorphic. He uses a different name for God. He introduces us to Yahweh for the first time. And this author, the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, has a completely different worldview. It's an earth-centered worldview. He never mentions the sky, the stars, the sun, the moon. He doesn't care. It's about creating Adam. And he only mentions the creation of the animals because he cares about whether Adam will find a helper that is worthy of him. So this is important for the creation of women and how women were viewed by the text. Later, Eve will eat the fruit first, and because of that, she'll be cursed, and we'll talk about that in the fall. But in the creation, Adam is made first. And then God makes all the animals, and he brings the animals to Adam one at a time. And he says, Adam, what are you going to call this? And it says it's not good for man to be alone. So it almost implies that God is trying out stuff. P would never do that, right? But God is trying out stuff. He's like, let's see if man likes dogs. And dogs are wonderful, but it's not enough. So he brings him a cow. And you like cow? No, cows are neat, but it's not enough. And the man is constantly rejecting the animals one at a time, naming them, but they're not worthy of him. And it says, from all these animals was nothing found that was worthy of the man. So God made Adam fall asleep and takes a rib from his side and makes a woman and brings him to Adam. And Adam says, this is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken from the man. And so in English, that works really well. In Hebrew, it works really well too. There's two words with different roots, but they sound alike. She should be called Ish because she was taken from the. So there's a pun going on there. The woman was taken from the man. And she corresponds to me. So in the King James, there's something called a helper meet for him. And that gets misinterpreted as help meet, almost like a helper side of beef. It's a misunderstanding of the King James. King James Old English, it meant corresponding to, meet, worthy of. It's meet for me to, it's worthy of me. He's looking for a helper that's worthy of the man and corresponds to the man and is his equal. In fact, the word implies equal in both its early English meet and in its Hebrew. It means a helper who is his correspondence and his equal. And among none of the animals was found something that corresponds to him until something was made from him. We're the same species, in other words. And God brings the woman to him and he says, this helper is now worthy of me. She's my equal and not my helper side of beef. She's She is my correspondence, helper, equal. And we'll talk about then what happens in the fall and what that has done to the role of women in Jewish mythology and therefore Christian mythology later. I'm sorry to put that off. I know we care about it, but we'll talk about that next. The order is different, you will notice. This author does not divide it up into creative periods. There is no day. There's just kind of a story that happens to have an order to it. And it's earth, streams, man, garden, vegetation, animals, woman. It is very different and it contradicts the earlier story. So again, there are literary reasons, not just scientific reasons, to say we shouldn't look at these two stories and try to figure out the scientific order in which animals were created. That's not here. The two stories contradict on that point anyway. And that's not the goal of the stories. The goal of the stories is to tell something, to tell us a story. One is the birth of the earth tied to ritualistic liturgy. And the next is to tell us a human story about where people came from and where evil came from, because according to this later author, evil enters the world when mankind rebels. So thus we get the story of the fall, which we will cover next time. So those are our two creation accounts and how they differ and what they mean for us, I think, a little bit, and we will cover the fall of man next time. Thank you. We're out of time, but are there any burning questions? And we got to get ready to go into the fellowship hall very shortly, but if anyone has a burning one, we can probably do that. Yeah.
So is the theology of Canaan different than the theology of Babylon?
Yes. So Canaan is best thought perhaps as a suburb of Babylon. And so their theology is similar because it's almost like, the U.S. has such an overarching culture, it impinges on everything around it. And we have something very similar happening here, and that is the Babylon has such a powerful overarching world that it impinges on everything around it. And so Canaan is related, but it's not identical. We're out of time.
It's fine. We have to use that.